Welcome to Macro Musings, where each week we pull back the curtain and take a closer look at the most important macroeconomic issues of the past, present, and future. I am your host, David Beckworth, a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and I'm glad you decided to join us. Our guest today is John Hartley. John is a macroeconomist and affiliated scholar and colleague of mine at the Mercatus Center. John is also a returning guest to the show, so check out his previous appearance if you haven't already done so. Now, John, along with Michael Bordeaux and John Cochran, have a new paper on John Taylor's contributions to economics, and this paper was presented earlier this year at Hoover. John joins us to discuss this paper as well as give us an update on R-Star and debt management at the U.S. Treasury Department. John, welcome back to the program.
David, an honor to be here.
Well, it's great to have you on. Now, quickly remind the listeners, you also have a podcast, great podcast I listen to as well. Tell us about that briefly in case listeners don't know. I suspect many of them do already, but just in case they don't, what is it?
Absolutely. It's the Capitalism and Freedom, the 21st Century podcast. And it's hosted at the Hoover Institution. And it's the official podcast of the Hoover Institution Economic Policy Working Group.
All right. So check it out, folks, if you haven't already. These are the two podcasts every week you should check out and make sure you're up to speed on your macro. Now, you have this great paper, John. You presented it at the conference. Actually, there were two conferences. There was a John Taylor conference on one day, and then right after that, there was another conference, the Hoover Monetary Policy Conference, happens every year. And you were part of this paper during that first conference on John Taylor. Now, you worked with Michael Bordeaux, John Cochran, so it's a really neat paper. You even collected a lot of statistics on his citations, number of articles. This is a really fascinating paper, and I want to get into it. But before we do that, John, I want to do something I did with you last time. Last time we were together, we had just finished the Shadow Open Market Committee conference, and we reflected on the conference a little bit. So any highlights from the Hoover Monetary Policy Conference you want to share with our listeners?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, one, there were many fantastic talks, both John Taylor celebration and at the Hoover Monetary Policy Conference. In reality, both of these were celebrating John Taylor and his contributions, which are quite incredible and substantial when you think about it in the long run. And I would preface it, and the beginning of our paper kind of says this, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But John Taylor truly is one of the greatest macroeconomists of the past 50 years. And I think a lot of these papers and talks across both days really explain why that is. And so there's, I think, obviously, for those that follow monetary policy, the Taylor rules become incredibly popular. There were some panels that were focused on that. For me, I really appreciated both Ed Nelson's dinner talk, which sort of connects the Friedman monetary economics legacy to John Taylor. And I also really appreciated Dr. Condoleezza Rice's talk as well. She spent a lot of time talking about John Taylor's contributions to public service. John actually served in Washington in several administrations. And most recently, he served as Undersecretary for International Affairs during the George W. Bush administration. And some people may not be aware of this, but John spent a lot of time actually helping set up the central bank in Iraq after Saddam Hussein was deposed. And so there's a lot of John Taylor's career, I'd say, outside of just his academic contributions, which are important, and also just thinking about where John Taylor fits into the history of monetary economics, I think was well appreciated. So I appreciated those talks for those particular reasons.
Yeah. And when we get to his paper, I want to share my story because John Taylor was my boss at the U.S. Treasury Department during one of those stints. But Condoleezza Rice mentioned a fascinating story I hadn't heard about. John Taylor, and I think it was Michael Boskine, were important in helping the Polish currency survive the transition from communism to democracy. But before we get to that interesting conversation, just a few thoughts here from that conference. Again, I love this conference. Every May it happens, so encourage folks if they can get out to it. But probably the most exciting panel I heard there, and I've actually had some podcasts follow up because of this, was the digital money, a digital payments panel. In particular, Louis Garicona was on one of them. And his presentation was so mind-blowing for me, dealt with dollar-based stable coins, how it was overtaking Europe. The Europeans are freaking out. So he came on the podcast later. We've had a fun conversation. I did a Substack on it. In fact, I'm doing my own interview later this week about stablecoins in Europe and other issues. So that was really fascinating. And then I have to mention as well, John, Peter Ireland's paper, because he talked about nominal GDP. And his point, and I have to mention this, is that even though the Fed is now a flexible inflation targeter, and maybe time permitting, we can talk about this new framework, but now that they've returned officially to flexible inflation targeting, his point was they could always cross-check themselves by looking at how fast the dollar size of the economy is growing. And I think that's just a real practical point. But a lot of fantastic panels there. Of course, the fiscal panel with John Cochran's very important because we're getting closer and closer, I believe, to the cliff here in fiscal dominance. But let's segue into your paper, all right? And it's a great paper. We'll provide a link to it in the transcript. But I want to mention up front what you just said. You said he was the greatest macroeconomist since Milton Friedman, at least over the past, 50 years or so. And in your paper, Rich Clarida says that the two most important papers, monetary papers, were Taylor's 1993 paper, where the famous Taylor Rule emerges, comes out, but then also Milton Friedman's 1968 presidential address at the AEA meetings, also a very important paper. Those are two very consequential, heavy-hitting, long-lasting influence papers, right? So it was neat to see Rich make that point. Why don't we step back and tell us, how did you guys get together and come up with the idea for this paper? Who said, hey, let's dig up all the records, let's collect and summarize his impact on the profession?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I've been working at Hoover with John Cochran, plus with Michael Bordo for a number of years now. And one thing that's often come up, and it's so wonderful to see, is we have so many wonderful economists at the Hoover Institution, and they truly deserve a celebration of their work. So we did a celebration for Bob Hall's work. Last autumn, we just did one for John Taylor, which we're talking about now, and we're doing actually one for Thomas Sowell in October. So these are economists that certainly deserve a festschrift-like celebration, and that's kind of how all these came together. And in particular, with this paper, I think really, I'm an empirical macroeconomist. I love using data to understand things, certainly macroeconomic dynamics and using identification. That's kind of my style with things. But I think sometimes it's just fun. We're macroeconomists. Obviously schools of economic thought are kind of important to think about a little bit. And in my mind, quantifying the impact of economists is very interesting. An interesting way to think about the impact of ideas over time. And so that's kind of how this all came together. And my contribution to the paper with John and Mike was really putting together a lot of this data. So we really just try and summarize a lot of the other papers being presented about John's career, whether it's academic or public service related. And some of the graphs that we have are wonderful because they show, for example, John Taylor's citations over time, and they also show, for example, John's influence in FOMC deliberations. So we went back to all the FOMC transcripts and really just looked at every single mention of John Taylor or the Taylor Rule, and it just counted those. And it turns out that it's actually been increasing quite a bit, in particular during the 2010s, and has been increasing pretty steadily. And I think really just getting back to sort of the citations and John Taylor's major academic impact, that there's really sort of two main areas. And we talked a little bit about the Taylor 1993 rule. There's also the Taylor 1999 rule that has a slightly bigger output gap that has quite a few citations as well. I mean, John Taylor's citations, unsurprisingly, explode with the 1993 Taylor Rule. And really, it's just a beautiful way to describe monetary policy, that it's both dependent on interest rates are both dependent on inflation in an output gap or some deviation from, say, full employment. So just qualifying that the stance of monetary policies is really critical. I mean, obviously there's an R-star component there as well that goes into the Taylor Rule. But what I think is also fascinating and perhaps maybe not as well appreciated about John Taylor in terms of how he fits into the history of macroeconomic thought is John Taylor also played a very important role with coming up with sticky prices in the basically in the early 1980s, and sort of to give you like a full and maybe very condensed version of, I guess, macro history in the past maybe 50 years or so. You had this period of the rational expectations revolution in the 1970s, lots of inflation. Basically, old Keynesianism kind of had died, but some people still believed that, and a lot of people still believed that money was not neutral and that monetary policy could have real effects on the economy. This was a problem because rational expectations models couldn't produce, it didn't have monetary policy producing real effects. So what did John Taylor think? Well, he said, well, if you have some sort of nominal rigidities, we can create real effects. And that's where Taylor's 1980 paper, or Taylor Contracts, comes in, and it's one of his most cited papers. But it's really important. Now, we today, a lot of macroeconomists, a lot of new Keynesian modelers today now use Calvo Contracts that came out a few years later, 1983, when the Calvo Contracts paper was published. There's also Rotenberg Contracts as well. Now, Taylor's contracts are based on fixed time intervals, whereas, long story short, Calvo pricing has basically fixed probabilities. It turns out that the Calvo pricing method was a lot easier, more tractable to use a model, to produce basically closed form solutions of the Phillips group. It's a long story short. But John Taylor Contracts were there in 1980, huge contribution in terms of sort of new Keynesian, early new Keynesian modeling, how to get real effects, how do you have monetary non-neutrality in macroeconomic models. John Taylor was there at the very dawn of new Keynesian economics. So very important. And then obviously, fast forward to 1993, we have there was also this problem going on in the 1980s, which was how do we is it money? The same is that the key policy instrument or interest rates? And so John Taylor really came in, demonstrated that interest rates were really the tool that central banks use to set monetary policy, and there were several other papers that there were sort of around that time trying to get at rules-based policy making and how to describe interest rates, but John Taylor was really there first to do this, and obviously, or one thing I guess that some people are maybe not familiar with, but it both has this ability to describe policy, but there's also sort of a theoretical component as well that makes it very nice or tractable, which allows you to get equilibrium determinacy. Very wonky, but that theoretical contribution as well, I think, is part of what made the Taylor 1993 rule so popular and so famous. But I know a lot of people, when they hear the Taylor rule, they think, well, the Fed doesn't really follow the Taylor rule, and there's been all these debates about whether how closely it follows it or not. I mean, if you run sort of that empirical regression, and obviously what our star we're using matters, whether you're using Lubbock-Williams or some other measures matters. What kind of output gap does the Fed use? How are you even measuring the output gap? That kind of matters too, right? But at some level, this whole idea of central banks don't necessarily follow a Taylor rule, mechanically to a T. And to be fair to John Taylor, he's never really advocated for that. But I think it's worth thinking about. For example, in recent years, the Federal Reserve in the inflation of the early 2020s deviated quite a bit from the Taylor rule. I think kind of regardless of what assumptions you're putting in there, I think, the Taylor rule perhaps looks pretty good coming out of that. Maybe there's a paper that was presented by Emi Nakamura at Jackson Hole this past week that sort of takes a counter argument to that the Fed shouldn't have, was wise to look through the inflation of the early 2020s as a supply shock. But I think at some level, if you look at the long run history of interest rate setting in the U.S. over the past 50 years, and you look at what the Taylor rule says and prescribes, it's an excellent way of describing monetary policy and the Fed's monetary reaction function.
Well, John, there is a lot there to unpack, so let me do it piece by piece here. Let's first go back to those charts you mentioned, and I encourage listeners to go look at these charts that you put a lot of work into, I can tell, John, but really fascinating, as you mentioned, a lot of John's big contributions, John Taylor's big contributions, they began to be seen later. So 1993, he has that prominent paper, and then the citations to it blows up. And you mentioned his later balanced approach also blows up. So it's a really cool chart. You see his lasting influence. You see how a paper, when it first comes out, may not have as big of an impact until later. And this paper clearly does. It has this lasting influence. And you mentioned Jim Bullard from the minutes or the transcript at an FOMC meeting where he talks about how influential John Taylor's Taylor rule has been. And it's worth noting there's the Taylor rule, there's the Taylor principle, which says you need to raise interest rates more than 1-for-1 with the increase in inflation. And then there's the Taylor curve. He has three, fairly well-known ideas in macroeconomics named after him. Very, very successful. So you
Taylor contract. Taylor contract.
Yeah, make that 4. Yeah. So, and I want to go back to that the staggered wage setting of that. You mentioned Harold Uhlig in the paper. He had his own discussion at this conference, and he made the case that maybe, sticky wages or staggered wages might be more relevant. We kind of defaulted on Calvo pricing because it was easier to work with, basically is what he argued, it mathematically more tractable. But maybe more realistically, we go something like wages. So let me step back from this, John, and ask you a question. So you're a young macroeconomist. You say you like empirics. What frictions do you see as most important? What is it? Sticky output prices, sticky wages? Some might say sticky information. Some might say sticky nominal debt contracts. Where do you think is the more important frictions that prevent markets from clearing instantaneously at the macro level?
Absolutely. Well, I think it's fair to say, I think we should, I'm definitely a bigger fan of, I'd say, using sticky wages or sticky information. I think, and this is sort of part of a forthcoming paper of mine, which is, I think sticky prices was, or has been a bit of a misadventure in the sense that, one, if you go back to Keynes's general theory, he really talks about sticky wages for the most part. And I don't know if this was, prophetic or not, but one, I think the reason why we largely have sticky prices in the Keynesian models today is because of this model tractability. It's a lot easier to simply just have Calvo pricing. You can get some very nice closed form solutions pretty easily. But I think something that I think is pretty obvious to someone living in 2025 is that prices and menu costs, prices aren't that sticky anymore. We have, whether it's, your Uber rides, your Lyft rides, or your Amazon prices, they're changing quite frequently and more frequently than offline prices. But now even, and for what it's worth, if you look at some of these statistics, you'll find that about 20% almost of all retail sales in the US are now online. So, menu costs have gone to almost zero, and for online, for about 20% of US retail, about 50% of Chinese retail, for example, is online. But now what you're also seeing at stores is you're seeing things like electronic shelf labels. And Walmart, for example, has said that they're going to put electronic shelf labels in half their stores worldwide by next year. These are the little electric or screens that have now, they're effectively now price tags. Have replaced paper or cardboard price tags. And now you can see them in many grocery stores that they become quite commonplace. Now, does that sort of mean, in my opinion, that means that menu costs are falling quite a bit. And I think for just an empirical reason, I think we should start thinking about, are we reaching the end of sticky prices? Are we reaching effectively zero menu costs? And I think that's good reason, perhaps, to really shift more towards sticky wages or sticky information of some sort. Behavioral macroeconomics is very much focused on sort of the sticky information kind of idea. There are older papers that have focused on sticky information. Think, Mankiw Rice. There have been many people calling for shifting to sticky wages over the years, and there's quite influential models that do this, but I think the time is now to make that shift. And if I can in any way convince people that there's an empirical case to do it, even though our models may be harder to solve, I would be happy to do it. And I think that would be a worthwhile effort.
So you're saying in a world of increasingly widely used dynamic pricing, where literally demand-driven changes in prices do take place because of technology, AI, all those things, we need to abandon the Calvo fairy and use these other tools, these other approaches. You mentioned sticky information. That makes a lot of intuitive sense. And I think we saw that during the pandemic. There's an interesting paper that was done that showed that most people really don't pay much attention to inflation until it hits some kind of threshold where they're triggered. Then they start work. So they're information insensitive up to a point, and so suddenly it matters when it matters. So those kind of examples, I think, underscore the sticky information point. I like myself also the sticky kind of fixed nominal debt contract story. Why haven't, for example, TIPS taken off widely? Why do we still see a lot more in nominal treasury debt contracts? And I have to infer that for some reason people like fixed nominal units on their bonds, on their money. So that friction may always be there. And then sticky wages as well. So interesting conversation, John. We look forward to you swaying the conversation in that in future years. You mentioned the Nakamura paper at Jackson Hole, and she mentioned, for example, the 21, 22 deviation. Maybe it wasn't such a bad thing, right? Maybe that's just in a world where you have a huge war effort, so to speak. So let's go back to the papers that were presented at Hoover several years back by George Hall and Tom Sargent. They compared the pandemic to World War I, World War II financing, right? You have to finance it somehow, and you kind of break the norms. And in fact, you had a paper by Robert Barrow, you mentioned this in your discussion, where he called the Taylor rule kind of a contingent rule, right? In normal times, you use it, but outside of normal times, it's like the gold standard. We suspended it during the Civil War. So what's wrong with that thing? And why not say, okay, Nakamura she made a reasonable point. Why would you push back against that?
Well, I think this comes back to this question of, what caused the inflation of the early 2020s, right? And there's several different explanations. And I think for me, it's both a supply and demand explanation that, sure, yes, there was a supply constraint, but you also had a surge in demand as well. And I think it's fair to say that stimulus payments had something to do with that. So and there's different, essentially observational equivalent models. I mean, you could sort of take the framework of, say, Larry Summers and Jason Furman, who kind of said, well, there's all this stimulus, though it's much bigger than the sort of Keynesian output gap that you would measure, and that should create inflation. You could take the fiscal theory of the price level sort of thinking of, John Cochrane, and you could say, well, at some level, they weren't promising to pay. There was no plan to pay it back, and so it's an inflationary event, and this worked through some sort of expectations channel that expected future surpluses weren't there, and so there has to be some inflation to basically make the fiscal theory equation hold. Or you could just take the sort of monetarist approach, the MV equals PQ. M jumped a lot. In my mind, I think it's pretty clear that the Fed acted too late, in that, sure, we can celebrate now that, sure, we didn't get some, recession following this tightening, but at some level, we still had this 20% increase in the price level or greater than that. I think that's not something to celebrate in any respect. And I think, had the Fed, I think if the Fed had acted earlier, if in October of 2021, when it was very clear that that the inflation story was not something about used cars or something that's very one-off and strange, that, it was very clear that owner-occupied rents were rising, that at that point, that was the point to begin tightening, not 6 months later when the Fed ended up doing so. And so I think the whole narrative of team transitory was so strong, and it was carried by people in the media, and it sort of gave the Fed this cover. And of course, nobody wants to necessarily be the Paul Volcker that causes a recession, right? I mean, it's a very difficult challenge, and I'm not saying that things could have been at the time. I think it was a very difficult narrative to fight against it. This was just something born by this 1 in 100-year pandemic, right? But at some level, I do think it's hard to ignore the politics of some of these things, and I think it's very, very difficult at some level to want to raise interest rates, to be the one that does that, and like the Taylor rule in this case would prescribe. I mean, so, a careful maybe thought experiment. I mean, I think if Donald Trump was president and April, May of 2021. And, had there been a big inflationary uptick, I think the narrative might have been a little bit different. I think, people would have, for political reasons, tried to attach the inflation narrative to Trump at that time, called it Trump inflation, rather than some team transitory kind of supply shocks narrative. And so and perhaps that's somewhat, maybe that's a somewhat cynical sort of a way of thinking about things. But I think the reality is, political narratives matter for economics to some degree, in trying to understand how we think about the macroeconomy. And we don't have the time to really do these sorts of excellent studies with excellent identification on the fly. We're often, policymakers really have to think about things very quickly and not necessarily have perfect answers. In my conversations with Rich Clarity, he's kind of made these sorts of answers. This is the difference between being like an academic, where you're getting a very precise answer, versus being a policymaker, where you have to have an answer that's good enough. And so, anyways, I think it would have probably been better to follow the Taylor rule a little bit more closely. And I think at some level, had some thought beyond the groupthink, we wouldn't have had as worse an inflation that we had.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to your point that a lot of the inflation was demand driven. I think maybe I would argue maybe even more so than you would. I think, fiscal policy, monetary policy, they definitely played a role. In fact, I have a working paper out that I'll link to in the transcripts. I also think, though, that there was a lot of uncertainty, say in 2021, right? The vaccines hadn't come out. And I think you could view the largest of fiscal policy as kind of an insurance policy that in real time, you just mentioned in real time, a lot of uncertainty, they threw everything against the wall. And in retrospect, yeah, we could have maybe calibrated that better. But I want to be, I guess, gracious in the sense that in real time, I think it's a little trickier. And again, I view this as, the Taylor rule is wonderful, but it's contingent. If you're in a major global crisis, I think you can, suspend that given the world you're in. Now, I think the counter argument you just made is a good one, though. At some point, though, you leave that world, right? And you have to start following the Taylor rule again. And I think you fairly point out they could have started tightening sooner. Well, let's move on, though, to the other parts of your paper, your Taylor paper. We've talked about the Taylor rule. We've talked about his work on macroeconomic theory and modeling. But he also did a lot of work on international macro. Tell us about his work there.
Well, John Taylor spent a lot of time working around the world, essentially as a consultant with many central banks. And so John Taylor in particular has made a lot of friends, Bank of Japan, and around the world. I mean, I think what's really important with John Taylor, and this I think gets back to what I sort of said earlier, John Taylor knew how to sell an idea. And, and I think it's a great model for academics who out there are trying to sell ideas to policymakers. He was a policymaker himself, but he also over time built a network of monetary policymakers around the world. So, for example, when we were at the Hoover Monetary Policy Conference a few years ago, we both met Kuroda, and it's amazing, seeing some of the inner workings of some of this. The Hoover Monetary Policy Conference is in many respects a culmination of John Taylor's sort of networking across central banks around the world, and so it's wonderful to see people, central banks from countries around the world come to this conference. But at some level, the Taylor rule is something that I think has had a good degree of influence in central banks around the world. But, just to sort of, I guess, where did this all begin, in engaging with central banks? Well, it really began at the Fed or with the Federal Reserve. And I remember talking to Don Cohn in how in the early 1990s, Don there was, I think, a seminal moment where Don came to Stanford and met with John. And so it began this process of really, John Taylor's, amazing, I think, engagement with policymakers. He served as Undersecretary for International Affairs, which is a very critical role in terms of international economic policy. But there's too many to list. Again, as I mentioned earlier, helping to set up Iraq's central bank. But truly, John's project of monetary policy rules really was an international one. And I think that that's really what I think, emphasize is that, that the influence of the Taylor rule is international. It's not just specific to the U.S. And sure, there might be slightly different weights, and different central banks, different policymakers have different reaction functions, but the Taylor rule is an international and global phenomenon. And in my opinion, that's why we say at the beginning of the paper that it's one of the greatest macroeconomists of the past 50 years. And in my opinion, there's one macroeconomist who we'll be talking about, or people will be talking about in 50, 100 years from now. I would be willing to bet that John Taylor is one of those macroeconomists.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And you get to work with him, John. You get to interact with him even now. So I, too, have been blessed to cross paths with him. Just my story real briefly. I went to the U.S. Department of Treasury right out of grad school. John Taylor was looking to hire some PhDs, and he took a chance on me. I didn't come from a great, pedigree university. So I go in there, and it was just great. He wasn't my immediate boss. He was the undersecretary. I was several layers down, but he engaged with me, very encouraging. And just being able to connect with him, I think, was consequential, because after I left Treasury, I did a paper with a friend on the international linkages of monetary policy. And John Taylor really liked that. And he cited it several times in his ongoing work on international economics. And then, John, I invited him onto my podcast. So back in 2016, when it first started, he was, I think, one of the first 2 or 3 guests on the show. And he agreed to come on because he knew me from Treasury and he loved the paper that I did. So we had a great time. It went well. And then a few days later, I get an email from him. He says, "Hey, David, would you like to come out to Hoover Monetary Policy Conference and present if you have something on international economics?" I was like, "Yeah, definitely." So I got the invitation to present at the wonderful conference you just mentioned, the Hoover Monetary Policy Conference. And my co-author and I, Chris Crow and I, we recreated a paper, or updated a paper that had looked at the composition of assets that foreigners hold on the U.S. So, we issued dollar bonds, repo, bank accounts, and we just showed the U.S. as this kind of banker to the world. We updated this paper by Helene Ray and Pierre-Olivier Gorenshaw. And during the Q&A, there's, of course, people asking questions. This one guy raises his hand and goes, "I commissioned that original paper, and I love what you're doing." Well, guess who that was? It was Rich Clarida. So then later I got to chat with him. And just from that story, I just met a lot of interesting, fun people. So I really owe a lot to John Taylor myself, my own career, just opportunities, connections. So I want to recognize his work too. And I just want to briefly mention one more thing on the international side. And you mentioned this in your paper, that he made some important contributions theoretically in the sense that he had these big models that looked at cross-country systems. And he found that instead of targeting exchange rates or trying to respond to another country's central bank, if each country had their own version of a Taylor rule, that was kind of the best outcome you could hope for, which is, I think, what you're alluding to, like everyone doing their own Taylor rule. But that was a really fascinating story.
Absolutely. And I think, again, it can't be, I think, overstated that, John Taylor's career, he wasn't the type of academic that would just, write an academic paper and publish it and be done with it. He would actually make the trips, to the Bank of Japan. He would make the trips to Europe, and he became a consultant to many central banks around the world. So he really believed in being both an academic and a practitioner. It's something that I think is maybe increasingly becoming rare. But I think, at some level, a huge part of how the Taylor rule became so influential was that, and there were others out there that I would say had, let's say, similar ideas. Don't want to spend too much time on that, but John really followed through, and rather than just and only publishing the paper, he actually went out and engaged with the policymakers. So I think that's an excellent model to follow for those that are trying to sell ideas.
Absolutely. And listeners, again, we provide the link to John Hartley's paper, in the transcript. So be sure to check it out. And I know it will be published in a volume soon, if not already, correct?
Yeah. So this will appear in essentially the conference volume that'll be published by the Hoover Institution Press.
Okay. So be sure to check that out. Now, John, I want to move on to some of your other work that you've done. In fact, you've done an interesting paper that attempts to get a better measure of R star. And, there's a lot of popular ones. You already mentioned the Laubach-Williams R-star from the New York Fed. Then there's the Holston-Laubach-Williams measure versions of it. There's a Lubbock-Mathis measure. The FOMC, you could also look at that. They have their long-run real federal funds rate, which could be approximately viewed as the same thing. And then I like to look at five-year forward tips. What does the market think? But of course, those tips have liquidity premiums. They're not perfect either. So no measure is perfect. And I'm looking right now at the latest data. The five-year forwards is about 2.5% all the way down to about 0.5% or 1%. So help me make sense of this and tell me why we should look to your new measure to help clear out, what really is going on with the star.
Absolutely. Well, so to sort of think about the history of our star, and it's, I think, quite appropriate that we sort of begin this conversation, talking about Laubach-Williams after talking about the Taylor rule, because it's very much related. And it's worth mentioning that John Williams, is a student of John Taylor's, also a Stanford economics PhD graduate. And, essentially there's this challenge, which is, what is the neutral rate, and how do we define the neutral rate? Well, the neutral rate is the rate at which, there's neither accelerating inflation or decelerating inflation. And that's, I'd say, maybe a very quick summary of it. But it's what's essential with the neutral rate is it allows us to estimate where this current stance of policy is. Is the central bank's policy tight, or is it loose? Is it accommodative, or is it restrictive? Right. And so we can't really assess this without some estimate of R star. So it's a very important metric for central bankers. R star is something that comes up very often in both monetary policy circles and also on Wall Street, because Wall Street, for example, if they're trading bonds, they want to know what the value of their bonds are going to be worth. And certainly they're impacted by interest rate risk and what the Federal Reserve does. And so R star, something that's very central. And Laubach-Williams in the early 2000s was sort of the first really popular way of estimating this. And then there were several follow-ons. Laubach-Holston-Williams does something similar, expands it to several more countries. You have Lubbock-Mathis. These are all what I would call model-based estimates of R star. And that they come out of, they're essentially reverse engineered out of a three equation new Keynesian-like model. And that's essentially kind of what's going on. And you kind of need the benefit of hindsight and history to be able to assess this, to estimate them. And so that's essentially what's going on. Now, my critique or challenge with these model-based estimates would be, well, what if the model's wrong? Or economists like to say, well, what if the model's misspecified? It's a fancy way of saying, what if the model is wrong and doesn't capture reality, right? And so one thing that I think is worth looking at and turning to as really an alternative are survey-based measures. And these are at some level atheoretical in that they don't come out of a model. But, the question is why not just ask people what they think R star is? And why not just take the median of that estimate? And so, as you mentioned before, the FOMC has been providing something like this since the beginning of forward guidance in the early 2010s with the beginning of the survey of economic projections, or the SEP. Remember the dot plots? Well, if you look at the right-hand side of the dot plot, there is this long-run estimate of what they believe the natural rate is. Now, we don't know whose dot is whose, but we can take the median of that, and we can assume that's the median FOMC participant estimate of what they think R star is. And I think that's at least heading in a slightly better direction. Now, something that was created in the early 2010s was something similar, which was in the New York Fed primary dealer survey. They started asking questions to market participants. Who are market participants? There are people who are, for example, working at primary dealers. Think the Goldman Sachs or the Morgan Stanleys of the world. That they're trading arms, or think increasingly hedge fund analysts. And so more recently, so the New York Fed primary dealer survey started asking questions to market participants what they thought the neutral rate would be. They started this in 2013. just this year, they've actually sort of expanded this survey. It's now changed names. They merged it with a similar survey that was essentially asking market participants, so not just primary dealers. So it has a new name now. And similarly, there's the ECB. They, in just the past few years, in their survey of monetary analysts, have started asking similar questions about the neutral rate. The Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, they started something called the survey of market participants. And they're all asking similar questions about essentially what you think the neutral rate of interest is, or what the long run neutral rate is, or the long run equilibrium rate. They're slightly worded. They're worded slightly differently, but all these questions get at what do market participants think R star is. And so my argument is simply this: why not just look at the median estimate of what market participants think the neutral rate of interest is, what they think R star is? Or why not use that in our models, or just in general, if you're a policymaker, to assess what the stance of monetary policy is? And so there's a few things that we learned, and this is all sort of cataloged in my paper on this, is Survey Measures of the Natural Rate of Interest, the title. And one, we learned that the survey median of market participants follows the median R star estimates of FOMC participants very closely. So one, it's hard to know exactly what's going on, whether, say, FOMC participants are following, for example, the median estimate that's being provided by the market participants, or whether the market participants are looking to the FOMC participants, what their R star measure is, or maybe they're looking at models, Lobach-Williams, Lubick-Mathis, and they're informing their assessment of what R star is. But the point is, say we're in a situation right now that, like, let's say, as of today, the Fed funds rate's 4.25%. Lubick-Mathis says that R star is around 4%, so saying that we're essentially at a neutral stance of monetary policy. Or if you looked at Lobach-Williams today, Lobach-Williams or Lobach-Holson-Williams would have R star at around 2.75%, which would suggest that monetary policy today is very restrictive, with a Fed funds rate around 4.25%. However, if we were to look at the median estimate of R star from market participants from that New York Fed survey, we'd find that it's roughly around 3.5%. That their estimate of R star is somewhat in between the Lubick-Mathis and the Lobach-Williams measure. And it's also very close to what the FOMC participants think. I think it's better to follow that estimate than maybe one or another model. And so the point, broadly speaking, is, one, an atheoretical estimate is something that we should think about. It's a nice data point to have. It's only a few central banks right now that actually are measuring this. I've been actually having several conversations with central banks around the world. If there are people who work at foreign central banks who are listening to this podcast and would like to create a survey question about the neutral rate of interest, or R star, would be happy to talk with them. But I think over time, what we're going to see is we're going to see more central banks launching these sorts of surveys, asking questions of market participants. These surveys ask market participants many more questions than just about R star, and really essentially about every macro variable under the sun, but that we can build up a big enough time series of estimates that we can start to rely on these sorts of atheoretical estimates of R star, rather than have to rely on these models that may be misspecified. It doesn't mean we should get rid of the models. I think it's important that we have them. It's important that market participants, FOMC members, central bankers can still look at them to form their assessment of what R star is. But I think it's nice if we can have a median survey-based estimate off the shelf. And that's the whole idea within Hartley 2024 survey measures of natural rate of interest.
And we'll provide a link to that, folks. It's a Mercatus working paper. John, it just hit me while you were saying this. I now know why President Trump wants the rate cuts. He's been looking at the Lobach-Williams measure. Clearly, he's a follower of R star himself and believes the right estimate is the Lobach-Williams measure. All right, on a more serious note, though, why not look at market measures? So why not turn to what one might say is a measure where people have skin in the game, right? So they're literally trading funds. They could lose money. Why rely on a survey versus an actual market measure?
Well, it's a great question. And I think that the common critique would be something that you just pointed out before, which is that there's a challenge with risk premium, all sorts of things that can bias these sorts of estimates, right? And you could make an argument, for example, is an inflation break even, for example, really a great estimate of inflation expectations? Well, sure, I think there's a good case to be made. But if you look in these crisis-like periods where, the tips real yields go crazy and nominal rates and one goes more crazy than the other, then, the break-evens really get out of whack really quickly. And is it that people are changing their inflation expectations suddenly? No, I don't think so. I think there's just a huge liquidity shortage essentially in the inflation-linked bonds is kind of what's going on during these periods. But it's a great question. And I think also there's an analog with the term premium as well. I mean, the term premium is kind of another one of these sort of esoteric measures, but you could argue that we should have a survey-based term premium instead of something that's, say a market-based one, if to just look at, for example, something like a term spread or another term premium-based model. There's several of them out there. Some are produced by the New York Fed, that if you want to sort of get away from this challenge of getting risk premium out of your models that can bias the expectations, then maybe we should stick to survey-based measures. So, again, there's all sorts of biases that go hand in hand with surveys, and I'm not saying that they're perfect, but I think, one, it's something that's new. It's an innovation. We didn't have these sorts of central bank surveys prior to the financial crisis. And it's actually only in recent years that central banks like the ECB, the Bank of Canada, Bank of England have started these sorts of surveys. But I think they're very useful tools. And we can also sort of get measures of uncertainty as well. We kind of get the 25th, 75th percentile of what the market participant estimate of R star is. But I think for that reason, maybe another good reason to consider these survey-based measures of R star and the term premium for that matter, rather than, say, market-based measures or model-based measures.
Absolutely. And when you turn to market-based measures, there are attempts to fix them, right? To clean out the liquidity premium, the risk premium. Think of a popular one by Diamaco, Kim, and Wade, or they call it the DKW measure. But then you're back to modeling, right? You're back to the very problem you were trying to get away from in the first place, because they have to impose some structure on the data in order to get this refined measure. So you're like, look, let's just cut to the chase. Let's ask people directly what's going on.
Exactly. Something very simple, hard to do, and central banks deserve a lot of credit for doing this. There's a lot of other wonderful information that's in these surveys. And I guess that the hard work of the paper for me is really just putting together all these estimates, going through every single time these surveys have been put out there. And in the case of the New York Fed, it's been many, many years, but no one had really compiled these together. And that's kind of the contribution of the paper. And building a time series. So this time series of survey-based measures from my paper is available on my website, jonathanhartley.net. And you can go to the data section. And you can find the latest measure of survey-based R star for the U.S., the Euro area, Canada, and the United Kingdom. So you can find it there. And the idea is to build up a time series that people are going to use. Again, something trying to market to central banks around the world, but this would be a good idea. But maybe in the same vein that John Taylor was, with the Taylor rule, this is, I think, a much more modest attempt, but really just trying to make the case that, again, through equation, New Keynesian models are wonderful, thought experiments, but may not be perfect from a quantitative standpoint. And the same challenge may exist with market-based measures, but at least you have people sort of filtering these things and coming up with their own survey-based estimate.
Yes. So use all the information available and use this new innovative approach that John is suggesting and has worked on. So check out his website. Now, John, the time we have left, because we're nearing the end of the program, I want to return to a topic that we discussed last time we were on this podcast together, and that is the government's debt management policy. How does it determine the structure of its debt, its average maturity? And when we were together last time, we talked about these claims that the Yellen Treasury under President Biden was going more towards bills, trying to shorten the average maturity, weighted average maturity. And I'm just wondering, where do we stand now? We're in a new administration, a new Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, no longer Janet Yellen. What's the latest and greatest on this front?
Sure. So, just, I guess, a bit of history. The Yellen Treasury in the fourth quarter of 2023 decided to pivot toward more issuance of short-term debt. At the time, if you look at sort of in a high-frequency window, it caused the 10-year yield to drop by about 4 basis points in a very short period of time. And some people, particularly within the GOP, were alleging that, one, this was not a good idea, in part because this is what some countries do, ahead of some sort of a default-like scenario or fiscal issues, that they're issuing more short-term debt and that there's certain rollover risk with more short-term debt, and that there was a political element to this, that this was like a backdoor quantitative easing to try and offset the effects of the Fed's then quantitative tightening ahead of the 2024 election. So there were a few things that were being said to criticize the Yellen. But now what's kind of interesting, and obviously with the suggestion that the next administration should reverse that policy. I mean, what's very interesting now is so far the Trump Treasury hasn't reversed the Yellen Treasury government debt management. And for what it's worth, when we were having these debates a year ago when I was on your podcast, and I actually defended this debt management decision, even though I certainly would and was very critical of Yellen on I think most other things. And the reason why I think having more short-term debt might make more sense is that Treasury bill demand is very strong. We hear about there's a lot of demand for safe assets, and I have this paper that tries to look at this under the microscope with high-frequency data and quantities and yields, and looking at these quarterly refunding announcements where the Treasury announces their future debt management policy, the maturity structure over the next quarter. And when you look at this under the microscope, it turns out that long-term Treasury bonds are a lot more sensitive to these announcements than Treasury bills. And so the takeaway is, well, if you had more short-term debt on the margin, well, you could maybe you could generate fiscal savings, have on average lower interest costs over time. And I think there's a good case to keep that policy. I would commend the best in Treasury on doing this. And so what's happened so far, we've had 3 quarterly refunding announcements since there's been a new administration. And essentially in June, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said in an interview that essentially rates look a little too high to issue more longer dated debt. And I think that is a good assessment in the sense that, especially now with challenges around an increasing amount of government debt, I think we have to be very thoughtful about how we issue that debt and at what maturities. And so there is this risk, I think, that if we were to go back to the pre-Yellen pivot, there is this risk that the term spread will blow up by some amount. Now, if you sort of believe that it would, the effect would be the same as what the high frequency Yellen effect was, which was just 4 basis points, 4 basis point higher term spread might. I certainly don't think would be the end of the world. But, there's always this sort of tail risk that could be something more. And I think, we don't want to be in a position where, we get something like what we saw in, the autumn of 2022, when Liz Truss took to power, and it was a very complicated story. It wasn't just about, I think, the release of the mini budget, but there was also sort of a UK gilts auction going on at the same time, sort of failed pension demand for longer term assets. So there's a lot going on the longer end of the curve. But I think there is some risk, of course, if you were to pivot toward more long-term debt, which could, potentially put a lot of upward pressure on the term spread. So I think, in my opinion, if you put this into a model, there's a case to be made for more short-term debt. And I commend, again, the best in Treasury for continuing on that Yellen pivot toward more short-term debt for the time being.
So am I hearing you correctly that the reason for doing this is lower cost for the federal government? We're concerned about fiscal pressures, so we want to do this for fiscal cost, or is it more that there's a demand for Treasury bills?
So I think it's both.
Okay.
At some level, we're talking about like relative Treasury demand, really. So at some level, if you had to buy a Treasury bonds, where along the curve would it be? One, I think there's just a lot more demand for short-term debt. In general, again, there's a lot of demand for money-like assets, for safe assets. And this also sort of, I would say, speaks to certain theories of term premium that say that that there are certain segmented types of investors that are focused on certain areas of the yield curve. So maybe it's money market mutual funds are very focused on the short end of the curve, whereas say pension funds are focused more on the long end, liability driven investing. But my sense is, in general, it's about, again, it's these debt management issues are about minimizing overall interest costs to the government. Really, that's what matters most. And it's kind of a risk management type of decision. And I think the assessment is that, again, there's a lot of strong demand on the short end of the curve, more so than the longer end of the curve. And let's not risk it. Now, there is a question about, to give you a sort of very brief history of government debt management. The Treasury used to do debt management very differently prior to the 1980s. And it adopted this stance of stable and predictable. Essentially, the idea was that think about long-term debt management. Don't be focused too much about what interest rates are today, and don't try to time the market too much. Now, in reality, Treasury is always doing a little bit of market timing to varying degrees. They're usually issuing more Treasury bills during recessions, and that's kind of the general pattern of Treasury debt issuance. But I think it's fair to say, and I wrote op-eds in the late 2010s about this, there's a pretty hard, roughly speaking, zero lower bound on interest rates. We could talk about negative interest rates a little bit, but there's a pretty serious bound there. And I think there were several people in the 2010s, late 2010s, including myself and John Cochran and others, that said, well, why not just issue a lot of long-term debt now and lock that in when rates are low? And it's not what Treasury did. And there were some who argued we should have 50-year Treasury bonds or 100-year Treasury bonds. The Treasury Borrowing Advisory Committee essentially poo-pooed this at the time and said that there wouldn't be enough demand for them. But there's this question of, well, should the Treasury, given today's interest rate environment, try to time the market or try to think about, are interest rates too high or too low? And I think so. Some people are suggesting that Scott Bessent is looking toward a regime of government debt management that's a little bit more focused on market timing than previously existed. And so again, he said in this interview back in June that rates looked a little too high to issue more longer dated debt. And so I would expect maybe something like that to continue. But I think in general, it sort of squares with this idea that perhaps, given where longer term rates are, we should be very careful about how much longer term debt we issue.
All right, John, in the last few minutes, I need you to help me out here. You've got me worried a little bit, okay? Because you noted that maybe some fiscal pressures is behind this move, lower financing costs. Now, by itself, not a big deal. But in the broader context of what I see happening, I find that a little alarming. So maybe walk me off the edge here. I'm going to tell you what I see, okay? And you can respond to this. You get the final word, okay? So number one, when I see President Trump calling on the Fed to cut rates, his motivation has been strictly to lower the interest costs on the debt. It's not like in 2019, he was calling it for more of a full employment, robust economy. It's very clearly, let's lower the cost of interest payments on debt. Secondly, we look at the supplemental leverage ratio tweak. One of the main arguments for doing that is it allows banks to pick up some slack and carry more treasuries on their balance sheets. Stablecoins. I love stablecoins, but one of the arguments is it's an extra source of demand for treasury securities. Senator Ted Cruz has called in interest on reserves. He thinks it will open up revenue to flow back into the federal government. I think that's probably wrong, but nonetheless, all these calls are motivated by fiscal pressures. And now on top of this, you're telling me there's a push for more treasury bills because it's a little more cost effective. I put those all together and it gets me worried, John, that we're looking at a fiscal dominance train that's coming toward us. Or am I misreading the symptoms here?
So I would take the bet on, I think take the other side of this trade in the sense that,
okay,
I am probably more optimistic about the U.S. than I think most others. On debt management, there's always this challenge of debt management as a question. As long as the government's issuing debt, there has to be some choice of maturities. I think, one, we should always be thinking about minimizing interest costs subject to some level of interest cost volatility. And I think at some level, being more thoughtful about this than we had in the past is something that I think is something of a positive. Two, I think in general, the narrative that there's a sovereign debt crisis on our doorstep, I would sort of maybe push back a little bit against, just in terms of where long-term treasury debt's at. One, 100% of debt to GDP is very far away from, say, where Japan is now. We're on a trajectory that could take us there, again, depending on how entitlements unfurl in the future. But as far as sort of losing dollar dominance and all these other issues, de-dollarization, things that we hear about all the time, I think are promoted often by people who, I guess, have certain, I'd say, interests that are maybe contrary to those in the U.S. There's Bitcoin people that sort of see, U.S. dollars laws and Bitcoin gain. There's people in the BRICS alliance who would love to see the U.S. dethroned, but I think that's very much a fantasy. If you look at all the measures, and there's a separate paper that I've written on this called De-Dollarization Not So Fast. If you look at all sorts of measures, whether it's the denomination of FX trades, whether it's the denomination of currency invoicing of trade, if you look at the denomination of central bank FX reserves, whether it's the denomination of debt around the world, the US dollar has held firm through COVID, through the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And today it's essentially no different than it was, say, just 5-10 years ago. In fact, things used to be actually worse in the, say, early 1990s. There was, roughly speaking, the fraction of all central bank reserves were denominated, the share was essentially 10% less than it is today in terms of US dollar denominated FX reserves. So we're still, I think, in a very, very good place. Of course, we're always at risk of losing this. Of course, I think we do need to think now about having fiscal reforms. I would be more worried about, for example, there being another recession, say another global financial crisis, another pandemic that sort of puts another sort of stimulus front and center. Those were the sorts of things that I think would be bad in the sense that they would get us closer towards something that looks like a bad sovereign debt scenario. But at some level, the U.S. still has the world's reserve currency. Treasuries are still the most liquid asset in the world. And so I think it's very, very difficult in my mind to bet against the U.S. I'm very much, I'd say, a U.S. optimist in that respect. And I think there's just so many things going for the U.S. Think about the generative AI revolution that's happening right now, all these sorts of things that could really benefit growth. How do we attack sovereign debt? Obviously, changing your deficits is one thing. Scott Bessent's very much big on his 3-3-3 plan, getting to 3% deficit to GDP ratio, which is, I think, very commendable. But there's other ways to pay down debt as well. Seniorage is one of those. We had some inflation a few years ago, 20% inflation. That certainly helps reduce the real value of debt. But really, economic growth is the third way of getting out of sovereign debt issues. And I really would look to and am excited or optimistic about how generative AI and sort of related transformations could potentially really be a boon to economic growth that, again, leads to more tax revenues that allows us to pay down our debt more quickly. Really, generative AI, that story is really specific to the U.S. and no other country really has that kind of innovative capacity. So at some level, I'm more optimistic about the U.S. because it has this capacity and ability to potentially and partially grow out of its debt, something that other countries don't have.
Well, that is a great positive note to end on. And I would add to that positive vibe I'm getting from you, John, that the Treasury market right now, 10-year Treasury is about 4.2, 4.3. So it clearly is not freaking out and worried about some fiscal crisis. And then one other thing, just really to go with what you've said, you mentioned the paper that was presented at Jackson Hole by Emi Nakamura. Well, there's another paper presented by Ludwig Straub, if I'm saying his name correctly. And he and his co-authors make the case that there's actually a lot more demand for assets than there is supply in the U.S. and the debt to GDP could go a lot higher than it currently is before we hit the wall. So those are some great positive notes to end on. John, thank you again for coming on the program. Listeners, we have links to all of his papers he mentioned in the transcripts. John, it was a real pleasure to have you back on.
An honor to be here, David.
Macro Musings is produced by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Dive deeper into our research at mercatus.org/monetary policy. You can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you like this podcast, please consider giving us a rating and leaving a review. This helps other thoughtful people like you find the show. Find me on Twitter at David Beckworth and follow the show at macro_musings.